Hi, everyone. Welcome to our fourth quarter Outlook webinar for 2018 from Informa Pharma Intelligence. I am Dominique Fontanilla, Therapeutic Area Director for CNS and Immunology and Inflammation. And today I'm joined by Hardik Patel, who is the Therapy Area Director of Oncology and Respiratory Diseases.
Hi, everyone.
And also I'm joined by Michael Haydock, our Therapeutic Area Director of Infectious Diseases and Cardiovascular and Metabolic Diseases.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar.
So this webinar accompanies our Q4 2018 Outlook report from Biomedtracker, where we cover catalysts from around 27 drugs, which are expected to occur this quarter, in addition to a complete list of large impact catalysts through the end of 2018. But for today's webinar, Michael, Hardik, and I will take you through some of the highlights. So first, I'll be speaking about two drugs in development specifically for postpartum depression, and then I'll go through Filgotinib, which is being developed for several inflammatory-related diseases. Michael will go over the highlights for a couple of drugs in hepatitis B, Epivir and ARO-HBV, and then a combination of Tivicay and Epivir in HIV. And finally, Hardik will take us through isatuximab in multiple myeloma, Tivozanib in renal cell cancer, and also larotrectinib in tumor agnostic indications. So as I mentioned, I'll start off by speaking about two drugs in development from SAGE Therapeutics, Zulresso and SAGE 217, both of which are synthetic versions of the endogenous neurosteroid allopregnanolone, or also known as brexanolone, and they target the ligand-gated GABA-A receptors. This has been a really big quarter for SAGE Therapeutics. There's been a lot of positive data that have come out, and both drugs are being developed for the treatment of postpartum depression, which is significant and very exciting because there are currently no on-label drugs that are approved for postpartum depression. So I'll start out with Zulresso. Zulresso is SAGE Therapeutics' lead compound, and it will likely be the company's first approved drug for the treatment of postpartum depression. It has a target PDUFA date of December 19th. Its FDA advisory panel meeting occurred on the 2nd of November last week, and it had overwhelming support. Our Biomedtracker likelihood of approval for this drug is 99%, which is 14% above average for drugs at the application stage. And just as a reminder, the Biomedtracker likelihood of approval denotes the probability of reaching FDA approval from the current phase, and it's expressed as a percentage. It's calculated as the product of each subsequent phase success rate to reach approval. And then this can change with the addition of a subjective score that's based on our analyst opinion. So just to set the stage, the vast majority of the FDA Advisory Committee voted that the data presented from 3 phase 3 placebo-controlled trials supported the favorable benefit-risk profile of Zulresso injection when administered by trained staff under a REMS program that the FDA still actually has to work out. The vote was 17-1 in favor. The data have been so impressive that one of the advisory committee members called this, and I quote, "a very exciting breakthrough. Since you approved Prozac, I think this is probably one of the greatest approvals we've ever seen." In moderate to severe postpartum depression, the main points that have come out of the data readout show that as compared to placebo, treatment with Zulresso elicits a very, very fast and significant reduction in depression scores within a matter of days. And the effects are durable, so they're still present at a 30-day follow-up with patients. And then other secondary endpoints showed that the rates of remission 60 hours after treatment were significantly higher, almost double, than placebo treatment, and almost 75% of patients who were treated with Zulresso had a 50% or greater reduction in depression as compared to only around 6% of patients in the placebo arm. And this was also at the 60-hour time point. So the significance of this is that postpartum depression is currently treated with standard antidepressants, which take on average around 4 to 6 weeks to work. And that really is too long, considering that these mothers also have to care for their newborns while feeling depressed or even suicidal in severe cases. In the developed world, the leading cause of maternal death after childbirth is suicide, and so the implications of Zulresso's fast onset of actions are pretty huge. There are, of course, some issues with Zulresso. The main one is its mode of administration, and tied into that is a slight risk for losing consciousness, although in general, the drug is really well tolerated. Zulresso is administered as an in-hospital 60-hour infusion, which is quite inconvenient. So during the trials, 6 out of 140 patients actually fainted during therapy administration. And so the FDA has stated that at-home infusion should not be allowed, and the drug has to be given in an inpatient hospital setting. And we still need to wait for the specifics that the FDA will allow Zulresso administration, as well as a REMS program that they still have to hash out. So it's likely that the IV administration requirements for Zulresso will be somewhat of a barrier to uptake, but that's why all eyes are on SAGE Therapeutics' oral formulation of brexanolone, which is SAGE 217, which I'll talk about next. So SAGE 217, as I mentioned, is currently in phase 2 development for postpartum depression, and the first data readouts are expected this quarter, which is definitely one to watch. If SAGE 217 is successful efficacy-wise and poses no new adverse events, then the drug is likely to generate significant revenue for SAGE Therapeutics. So far, we have seen phase 2 data for SAGE 217 in major depressive disorder, and the drug's likelihood of approval is 20%, which is 8% above the average phase 2 LOA. And currently, the drug is being positioned in an oral, once-daily, 2-week course of treatment, which is quite novel. Again, as with Zulresso in postpartum depression, phase 2 data show a rapid onset of action with meaningful reductions in the HAM-D scores starting on day 2 and are still present at day 28. In addition, the rates of remission after the 2-week course of treatment were significantly higher, around 3 times in the SAGE 217 cohort as compared to placebo. And in terms of safety, the drug is generally well tolerated with no deaths or severe adverse events. And with this oral formulation, we're getting rid of that 60-hour infusion time period. And so you're getting rid of that fainting episode as well. There are some questions with regards to the durability of the drug, but again, this is something to look out for later this quarter and into 2019. So SAGE Therapeutics will be initiating a placebo-controlled phase 3 trial in major depressive disorder this quarter, and they have also finished enrolling a phase 3 trial in postpartum depression, which will have data readouts starting in January 2019. And in addition, they are collecting data regarding long-term and episodic retreatment, which will be really interesting to see. Before I move on to Filgotinib, Michael or Hardik, did you want to ask any questions at all?
Sure, I can jump in there. So given you've already mentioned Zulresso, and it looks like that's highly likely to get approved for PPD, how do you see the company positioning SAGE 217? Do you see it as a kind of complete replacement, or do you think it will be a SAGE 217 comes after Zulresso in terms of treatment?
I think it really depends on SAGE 217's data that will come out in postpartum depression. If the data are good, I think it's quite possible that we'll see both scenarios. because KOLs that we spoke to thought that Zulresso could be used for really severe, imminently dangerous cases in the hospital and then switch to the SAGE 217 oral formulation. But also, I think because it looks like the administration of Zulresso is going to be really inconvenient for the patient and it'll require extra training for hospital staff in a specialized inpatient hospital setting, it's likely that SAGE 217 will replace Zulresso in most cases.
Just another follow-up question from me as well. Are there any specific patient groups within depression that you think could particularly benefit from this type of short course episodic dosing besides the postpartum depression group, or is SAGE 217 more so just seen as kind of an alternative to continuous treatment, do you think?
So I think that this fast onset of relief is really quite attractive to other patient groups as well within depression. It certainly doesn't help when drugs take a matter of months to work, and if they don't, you have to find another alternative that works, or a dose adjustment, which takes more time. But the caveat here, again, is that we have yet to see any long-term data or data in chronic depression or, again, data with episodic retreatments or even treatment-resistant depression for SAGE 217. So I think we have yet to see that those readouts before we can see where it fits in the treatment paradigm. But again, the fast onset of action is really attractive to, I would guess, a lot of the subgroups in depression. If that's it, I will move on to Filgotinib. I also wanted to talk about Filgotinib, which is a selective Janus kinase 1 inhibitor from Gilead and Galapagos, because recent data in some inflammatory diseases show that Filgotinib has a lot of potential here, and we're looking forward to more data releases this quarter as well as into 2019. Updated phase 3 results from Filgotinib's FINCH 2 trial in rheumatoid arthritis were released this quarter at the ACR meeting in October, as well as published phase 2 data in axial spondyloarthritis and psoriatic arthritis. Our likelihood of approval for Filgotinib in RA is 69%, which is 10% above the phase 3 average, and our LOA in axial spondyloarthritis is 23%, which is 3% above the phase 2 average. I will also just mention that our LOA for Filgotinib in psoriatic arthritis is 5% above the phase 2 average at 25%. So this quarter, we are also expecting top-line pivotal phase 3 data for Filgotinib in ulcerative colitis. And if positive, it will likely add to the drug's repertoire of positive data in all these indications: RA, axial spondyloarthritis, psoriatic arthritis, as well as Crohn's disease. In RA, Filgotinib, in combination with conventional synthetic DMARDs, reached its primary endpoint in the phase 3 FINCH 2 trial, and around 57.5% of patients taking 100 milligrams of Filgotinib and 66% of patients taking the higher dose, 200 milligrams of Filgotinib, achieved ACR 20, which is a 20% improvement of tender and swollen joints as well as other rheumatic criteria, as opposed to only 31.1% in the placebo arm, and this was at week 12. So these were in patients with moderate to severe RA who don't respond adequately to biologic DMARD. So I think this was pretty good data for Filgotinib. We also saw this quarter published phase 2 results, as I mentioned, in both axial spondyloarthritis and psoriatic arthritis, where Filgotinib met all primary endpoints. So in general, we're seeing that based on numerical data, at least, Filgotinib will be able to compete with other JAK inhibitors in development or which are currently on the market. And based on the numbers as they are now, it looks like Filgotinib shouldn't have any trouble gaining approval for the indications where it's in late-stage development. However, once it gets to the market in, say, RA, it seems like there's going to be a lot of competition to face, particularly from Pfizer's Xeljanz, Olumiant from Eli Lilly, and potentially AbbVie's upadacitinib, which is also a JAK inhibitor, which is in development. Safety, it seems, will be a key differentiator here, especially since Olumiant has a black box warning for cardiovascular events. In the FINCH 2 trial, there were no reports of deep vein thrombosis or pulmonary embolism, which is good for Filgotinib. And however, in the Tortuga trial, we saw that one patient in the Filgotinib arm experienced deep vein thrombosis. So this is definitely something to watch out for in the top-line data in ulcerative colitis that will be coming out, and that will likely dictate how the drug will be perceived as compared to other JAK inhibitors. So that is definitely, the safety data is something to look forward to when this top-line phase 3 data come out. And if Michael or Hardik, you have any questions, I was going to move on and hand it over to Michael.
Thanks, Dominique. I just have one question about where you're expecting Filgotinib to be positioned relative to the anti-TNF agents, because I know with Xeljanz, there's some discussion whether it would be placed after the TNF agents or before based on its price. I was wondering if either the company has said anything or just you personally have any expectations as to where it will be positioned.
Yeah, so I guess looking at the clinical trials, initially it looks like Filgotinib is going to be positioned for patients who aren't able to respond well to biologic DMARDs and also methotrexate, so it will likely be after any first-line therapy. But then Filgotinib also has another phase 3 trial, FINCH 3, which is being tested for the first-line setting, and those data are going to come out in early 2019. So the potential is there. I think it's a bit too early to say, though, without the data or long-term data, so we'll have to see. And then also, I guess, based on pricing, how it's priced against Xeljanz.
Perfect, thanks.
One more question from me,
Sure.
Dominique. Given that Filgotinib is in development for so many different indications, are there any particular indications where you think it has higher potential to make a larger impact, or is it kind of about the same across the board?
So I think that if it's successful, Crohn's disease looks like a very promising indication for Filgotinib, just mainly because there aren't any oral drugs in Crohn's, and so Filgotinib's oral formulation will be a really significant advantage here. In addition, Xeljanz didn't do so well, and the program was actually suspended in Crohn's disease. So Filgotinib has that potential to make a large impact in Crohn's. If there is nothing else, I will pass it on to Michael.
Thanks, Dominique. Hello, everyone. I'd like to talk you through a few infectious disease catalysts. Firstly, a couple for hepatitis B, and then finally one for HIV. So just to get started, first drug which has created some waves in the last month or so in the hepatitis B field is ARO-HBV. So a drug originally developed by Arrowhead, although they've recently initiated a partnership with Johnson & Johnson to further develop the drug, and that was based on some very positive data, which I'll talk through in just a second. But this drug is particularly interesting. It's an siRNA, so a small interfering RNA agent, and it aims to induce functional cure either as a monotherapy or more likely in combination therapy. So there's a couple of catalysts we'll be looking forward to this quarter in Hep B. The first one for ARO-HBV is updated data from a higher dose cohort. So I mentioned earlier data that was very promising. It came from a phase 1, phase 2 study called ARO-HBV 1001. And the top-line data are extremely promising. There were 4 cohorts being investigated, so it's an ascending dose study. There's 100, 200, 300, and 400 milligram cohorts. Last month, Arrowhead released data from the earlier dose cohorts, or the lower dose cohorts, the 100 and 200 milligrams, And the data were extremely promising. After just 3 months of treatment, their hepatitis surface antigen, or HBsAg, declines of 93 to 99%. And longer treatment durations and or combination therapy could achieve functional cure. And just to give a bit of background as to what I mean by functional cure for those who aren't too familiar with hepatitis B, functional cure is measured or defined as a loss of surface antigen in addition to suppression of hepatitis B viral DNA, which is a measure of viral replication. Now, currently available treatments are extremely poor. They have dismal rates of surface antigen loss. They're the oral nucleotide analogues that are typically used as the current standard of care are very effective at suppressing hepatitis B virus DNA, suppressing the viral replication, but they have negligible impacts on surface antigen. And effectively, that means that currently patients who initiate oral therapy are expected to receive that therapy for life, unless they're one of the lucky 1 or 2% of patients who do manage to achieve surface antigen loss. So there's a huge amount of unmet need in this field, a lot of early phase pipeline interest in any new modes of action or combinations of new modes of action that are able to induce surface antigen loss. So clearly this drug, given it's able as a monotherapy to induce very substantial surface antigen declines in a relatively short treatment period in hepatitis B, that's extremely promising. So the top data were great. We've actually already had the abstract for the data from the higher dose cohorts released a few weeks ago. It's going to be presented at the upcoming liver conference. And so far, the 300 and 400 milligram data are equally promising. Interestingly, there doesn't seem to be a clear dose response. There's a few theories as to why that might be. It might be because the patients are a mixture of e-antigen positive and e-antigen negative patients, and this drug seems to fare better in the e-antigen positive patients. So it might be that the e-antigen negative patients were kind of confounding that dose response. But irrespective of this data, assuming there's no surprises in terms of safety, it seems a very promising drug. As I mentioned, there's a partnership with Johnson & Johnson, which has its own portfolio of new modes of action, including capsid assembly modulators, therapeutic vaccine, and TLR7 agonist. It's also likely to be the first siRNA agent to market, so it does have a competitor called ARB1467 made by Arbutus, which is its most advanced threat, but it has a less attractive IV formulation and in earlier studies has showed less attractive declines in surface antigen compared to ARO-HBV, which is administered subcutaneously. So pretty promising agent, definitely one to keep eyes on because it could well form the backbone of future combination regimens for hepatitis B. So any questions at all, Dominika Hardik?
I think it looks pretty promising. I know it's like only phase 1, phase 2, but so what do you think the drug will need to show in order to, in future studies, to gain approval?
So I think one of the main things that we'll need to show is how sustainable these responses are. So this is an siRNA drug that effectively prevents translation of the viral transcripts, which seems to be why it's so effective at preventing expression of surface antigen and therefore causes the declines. I guess the big question that we still need to answer is, I guess, A, are these results able to be replicated in larger patient numbers? So currently there's only been data from 8 patients released, although all of them seem pretty consistently promising. The second question is how sustainable this is when you withdraw treatment, which is why I suspect combination therapy will be required because one of the other aspects of controlling hepatitis B, which I'll go into actually on the next drug I'll discuss, is stimulating the host's natural immune response to control the virus, because of course once you withdraw antiviral therapy, unless the immune system is able to maintain that control of the virus, it will be quite hard theoretically to maintain that suppression of the virus and surface antigen loss. So in terms of endpoints, I suspect when it comes to the phase 3 studies, I believe the guidance that they'll be looking to show is after treatment has ceased, is this surface antigen loss and hepatitis B DNA viral load still suppressed 24 weeks after treatment, which or SVR 24. I suspect that will be the main endpoint they have to show in phase 3 studies, and it's analogous actually, interestingly, to what was originally required for hepatitis C drugs. They originally also had to show that once you stop treatment 24 weeks after, the virus remains undetectable.
Just one other question from me, kind of on ARO-HBV's competitor, ARB-1467. Given that ARO-HBV seems to have kind of better data at this point and a more convenient route of administration, is there any particular method that Arbutus might use to kind of differentiate their product at all?
I suspect what they'll do is end up actually replacing it. So, as I mentioned, it's intravenously given at the moment. They actually have a second-generation siRNA agent in development that uses a new GalNAc subcutaneous delivery system, which I believe is actually the similar system to what Arrowhead is using. So I suspect what they'll do is use the data they've already generated as proof of concept that you can reduce surface antigen, and then they'll move to a new delivery system. So they will lose ground, I'm sure, but I think it makes the most sense given, as you mentioned, IV formulation, particularly if you're expected to continue treatment for months or a year, let's say. That's going to be pretty inconvenient compared to a subcutaneous agent. So, assuming there's no more questions, I'll go on to my next hepatitis B drug I'd like to discuss, and this one is called Inirigavir. And this is another interesting approach in hepatitis B, being developed by a company called Springbank Pharmaceuticals. Inirigavir is an oral immunomodulator, which again is quite interesting for hepatitis B. There are currently approved immunomodulators. Peginterferon alpha, or Pegasus, is the one that's typically used in hepatitis B, but that's a subcutaneous injection, and it has relatively poor side effect profile, so it's very much used in a minority of patients who are pre-selected for likelihood of giving a good response. So this drug has shown, again, reasonably promising data from early phase 2 studies. It's likely to be positioned as a more tolerable oral immunomodulator to interferons, and it paves the way, really. There's quite a few options available for this drug in terms of how it's positioned in the treatment algorithm, but it's likely to be used in either combination, so add-on treatment strategies, or in sequential treatment strategies. So you finish treatment with the existing regimens and then add this on. Could be another potential option. So we're expecting a couple of catalysts for this drug that are quite important. So the first one will be updated data, again, from a higher dose cohort of an ongoing phase 2 Achieve study. And then secondly, which is particularly interesting, there's going to be data released this quarter from another phase 2 study that's investigating this immunomodulator in combination with one of the current standard of care oral nucleotide analogues called Venlafaxine. And that's part of a collaboration actually with Gilead, who are one of the major players in hepatitis B. Gilead's taken an interest in this drug and is likely to see it positioned as an add-on to its oral nucleotide analogues. So we've had some initial data already of this drug, showing that it has a moderate impact on hepatitis B viral DNA and RNA levels. Interestingly, it seems to have greater efficacy in e-antigen negative patients, which is the converse of the ARO-HBV drug. What's interesting for this drug actually is that, as I said, it's an oral immunomodulator. For an oral drug, it actually showed quite promising surface antigen declines in a minority of patients. So only about 28% of patients achieved a predefined cutoff of half a log, which I think is about 68% reduction roughly in surface antigen. And whereas that's promising for an oral drug, it seems like this drug as a monotherapy is very unlikely, based on those initial results, to be able to achieve high functional cure rates in a wide range of patients. But as I said, there's quite a few interesting avenues forward. So once we just confirm its tolerability and safety when combined with an oral nucleotide analog, one of the future options that this drug could explore is combination treatment with an siRNA agent, so possibly ARO-HBV. And that would be great because Inirigavir, again, in that early data from the Achieve study, which we'll be seeing more of later this month, it showed actually that the declines in hepatitis B DNA and RNA, which are, if you like, secondary endpoints to surface antigen, were actually better in patients who had lower baseline surface antigen levels. So in theory, if you combined this with an siRNA agent, it might be that it has a greater impact and a greater ability to induce immune control of the virus. I guess that would make sense because one of the theories behind surface antigen is that it effectively it induces tolerance. So it basically is like an immunosuppressant. It stops your immune system responding against hepatitis B virus as effectively. So it would make sense if you could suppress surface antigen levels and then treat with an immunomodulator. Seems a very promising strategy. As I said, there's quite a few options open for this drug in terms of future combination strategies with Vemlidy and or any other agents, including siRNAs. So again, another one to keep an eye on. We've currently got our LOA at 2% above average, so the average is 27% given its relatively early phase of development, but we'll be monitoring that very closely. Any questions at all, Hardik or Dominique?
So I guess, assuming that it reaches the market, what would Enovirovir's main competition be, do you think?
So in terms of immunomodulators, there are a few other modes of action. I guess probably the closest competitor in terms of immunomodulation would be TLR agonists. So TLR7 and TLR8 are, I believe, the primary candidates. So again, those aim to kind of kickstart the immune response against the virus. So they're probably the most direct competitors. There's a massive range of other agents in development, including capsid assembly modulators, therapeutic vaccines, etc. So in theory, it could face competition from those, but I'm not really expecting the capsid assembly modulators in particular to have any significant immunomodulatory impact. They'd be more a direct antiviral approach. So it's got relatively limited competition as an immunomodulator, and I guess the benefit of being an immunomodulator rather than trying to suppress the virus by any sort of direct acting antiviral effect, which funnily enough it does have, but that's not its primary role, is that it can be so flexibly positioned, either sequentially or as add-ons. So it's got a lot of potential there, a lot of flexibility. So even if other candidates do show quite promising results, there's always still the chance that addition of this drug will improve surface antigen loss rates. And with that, I think I'll move on to my final catalyst, which was an HIV drug. It's an HIV drug called Tivicay Epivir, being developed by Viiv Healthcare. The molecules are dolutegravir, which is Tivicay, and lamivudine, which is Epivir. And now this is an interesting drug because it will be the first ever two-drug regimen approved for treatment-naive patients, so your first-line patients who've never received treatment before. The catalyst actually occurred back in October, I believe. Viiv Healthcare filed for US approval of the drug. I believe they filed for approval in the EU in September. So you can see here a very high likelihood of approval based on some of the data I'll discuss. So we have its likelihood of approval at 8% above average. And it's shown very promising results so far for a two-drug regimen. And bearing in mind the current standard of care in HIV for the last couple of decades really has been use three drugs. And the reason behind that is to ensure the best efficacy and also to reduce the chances of resistance generation. So it's a very ambitious strategy that Viiv Healthcare has been pursuing the last 2 years or so to try and develop two-drug regimens and really to try and gain a stronger foothold in the market against Gilead, whose portfolio is dominated by three-drug regimens. So there was data released earlier this year from the pivotal Gemini 1 and 2 studies, which investigated Tivicay Epivir as a two-drug regimen against Gilead's backbone, which is Truvada. That's actually two drugs in a fixed-dose combination. So Truvada is two drugs plus Tivicay, which is one of the recommended integrase inhibitors. And it's very promising data, given these are treatment-naive patients, so they're not currently suppressed, i.e. they're harder to treat. And you can see that I won't go through all of the data points, but it showed non-inferior efficacy at week 48. And importantly, one of the concerns with this drug, particularly going from three drugs to two drugs, is that if you were to omit the third drug in patients with high viral loads who are considered harder to treat, so it's over 100,000 copies of the viral RNA per milliliter is how that's defined. The worry there was if you try and treat those patients with a two-drug regimen, you're going to increase your risk of virologic breakthrough and also resistance generation. But promisingly, that didn't manifest. So actually the virologic suppression rates at week 48 were comparable across low and high viral loads. And also, very promisingly, there was no resistance to either the NRTI component, which is Epivir, or the INSTI component, which is Tivicay. And that wasn't observed in any of the patients who did experience virologic failure. So fewer than 1% of patients did, but fortunately, none of those patients developed resistance, which is again very promising. And there's an ongoing Tango study which is investigating this drug use as a switching regimen, so in virologically suppressed patients who are currently stable on a 3-drug regimen, can you swap them over to a 2-drug regimen and maintain that virologic suppression is the next question that they're looking to answer. So in terms of the outlook for this drug, as we mentioned, it's already filed, so we wanted to give you a bit of an idea of how we're expecting this drug to influence the market. So this drug and some other 2-drug regimens that Viiv Healthcare is developing, Juluca is actually already approved, is in the maintenance setting there. And there's also a long-acting injectable called cabotegravir or Epivir, which again is another 2-drug regimen, but novel not only for being 2 drugs, but also for being a once-monthly injection and potentially even a once-bi-monthly injection, which would be very attractive. So we're expecting together Tivicay, Epivir, and those other 2-drug regimens to greatly increase Viiv Healthcare's share over the next 10 years. So we estimate it currently around 24% of the US, Japan, and 5 EU market, and we're expecting that to grow in terms of sales value to 44% in 2026. And the main drivers really will be Tivicay, Epivir, and these other 2-drug regimens that are expected to gradually capture share from Gilead, largely due to anticipated lower price. So any questions there?
I had just one quick question, Michael. Given that the current standard, as you mentioned, is the 3-drug regimens, I guess how do you think physicians will respond to these new 2-drug regimens coming to market?
It's a really good question, actually. From the KOL, the key opinion leaders we've spoken to, initially they were quite reluctant because they wanted to see longer-term data, and also they wanted to see what the issue was with patients with high viral loads. I think one of the questions Viiv Healthcare still has to answer, despite the initial 48-week data being very promising, is what happens in the long term, because some of the key opinion leaders we've spoken to said yes, that the initial 48-week data is promising, but given that patients who are receiving HIV therapy typically receive it lifelong, you want to be really following these patients up for 3, 4, maybe even 5 years to just really ensure that actually you don't start to see resistance creeping in later on. So I'm expecting the initial uptake to be reasonably muted. We do think they have blockbuster potential, but for the first couple of years, it's likely that there'll be that initial resistance, which is why I suspect Viiv Healthcare will launch the drugs at a lower cost to try and incentivize people to try this, because I'm sure there will always be some physicians who are quite hesitant to go from 3 drugs to 2 drugs until the longer-term data is available. So Viiv Healthcare is intending to generate that 2-drug data, but we're expecting this drug to be approved in April 2019 in the US. And by that point, it's likely that only the 48-week data will be available, possibly 96-week data. But as I say, the people we've spoken to are really looking for a good 3 or 4 years, ideally. If there are no other questions, I'll pass over to your capable hands, Hardik. Oh, sorry, I have one more slide. I forgot to mention. If anyone does want to access any of the forecasts that we show in this webinar, if any of you have access to Datamonitor Healthcare, I just wanted to highlight how you can access this information. So if you just go onto the home page in Datamonitor, first step would just be to click on the disease channel that you can see in the top left there, navigate over the therapy area that you're interested in, and once you navigate over that therapy area, you should see some sub-indications appear. So you can see HIV there as number 3. Whenever you click on any disease, you'll then be taken to a separate page that you can see in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen there, and all you need to do is click on the Forecast tab, and you'll see some detailed analysis that you can read on screen or download in PDF format. And then on the right hand of the screen, there's an interactive dashboard that you can play around with some of the numbers, sales and patient numbers, and just apply various filters to slice the market how you like. And also we offer Excel data packs. So again, if you're a numbers person, feel free to download those and play with the numbers. But yeah, with no further ado, I'll hand over to you, Hardik.
Thanks, Michael. The first product I wanted to talk about today was Izatuximab, which is a CD38-targeted monoclonal antibody. It's being developed by Sanofi specifically for multiple myeloma. Earlier on, the company previously announced that top-line data from pivotal phase 3 trial Arcaria is testing Izatuximab in combination with Pomalyst and dexamethasone, and that will be released of Q4 of this year. And also that they'll be filing a BLA based on this data, which is also supposed to happen before the end of the year. The filing will likely be for multiple myeloma patients who have received at least 2 prior lines of therapy, since this was the target population of the study I just mentioned. But the combination, looking at early phase trials, was shown to demonstrate an ORR of 56%. But this was in a patient group who had a median of 4 prior lines of treatment, so slightly heavier treated patients than the trial population. And looking forward to its other studies, Sanofi's also looking at Izatuximab in earlier lines of treatment in order to kind of help boost its commercial potential going forward. The chemo trials testing the drug in combination with Kyprolis and dexamethasone in patients who received 1 or 2 prior treatments. And additionally, the IMROS trial is testing it with Velcade, Revlimid, and dexamethasone, that quad regimen, in first-line patients. If these additional trials are successful, they should help boost Izatuximab's uptake, especially going on into longer term and later down the road. But the drug will nonetheless face a lot of competition from Darzalex in pretty much all treatment settings that it's going after. Darzalex has the same mechanism of action as Izatuximab, and the key difference being that Darzalex has been approved in the U.S. since 2015. So given that, Izatuximab's Arcaria trial will need to demonstrate data that's at least comparable to Darzalex in order for the drug to gain a decent amount of uptake. But assuming that this does happen, Izatuximab's projected to generate at least over $600 million in annual sales by 2026, but there's expected to be continued growth after that. Before I move on to the next product, but any questions on Izatuximab?
I guess looking at the IMROS trial and the quad combination regimen, is that a concern at all, like in terms of safety or cost?
Yeah, really, I guess anytime you combine 4 therapies like that, toxicity is always going to be a concern, but the triple combination of Revlimid, Velcade, and dexamethasone has been tolerable enough to become kind of the preferred and recommended regimen for first-line patients, regardless of whether they're eligible for a transplant or not. I'm not aware of any data so far on the Izatuximab plus RVD regimen, but there was some data presented at ASH last year for a phase 2 trial testing Darzalex in combination with the Revlimid and Velcade regimen. And that safety analysis only included about 16 patients, but overall the regimen was deemed to have a manageable toxicity. No patients discontinued the treatment during that short period of time, and there was only 3 patients that experienced serious adverse events, so it's relatively manageable toxicity. And in terms of cost, based on our projections, generic versions of both Velcade and Revlimid are expected to be available in the U.S. before this quad regimen would be approved for Izatuximab, so I don't see cost being too much of an issue. If anything, it would be the toxicity. Any other questions on Izatuximab? I'll move on to the next product, which is Tivozanib, which is a product which has a pretty interesting development history. It's a VEGF inhibitor being developed by Aveo Oncology for RCC, and the drugs had a kind of an interesting history. It was initially tested for RCC head-to-head against Nexavar in previously untreated patients in the Tivo-1 trial, which was used to support regulatory filings. The drug was approved in Europe based on this trial, but the company received a complete response letter from the FDA saying that the results from Tivo-1 were kind of inconclusive. And this was predominantly because the trial met its progression-free survival endpoint, but the overall survival was actually slightly worse in the Tivozanib arm. The company representatives during the AdCom meeting argued that this was likely because patients in the Nexavar arm who progressed on treatment were allowed to cross over to the Tivozanib arm, but the same wasn't true for patients progressing on Tivozanib. But even so, the FDA still said that the approval of a drug which actually demonstrated a reduction in overall survival wouldn't be within their history of approvals. It would be without precedent. So they did send AVEO a complete response letter stating that another trial would be required if they wanted approval in the U.S., which is where TIVO-3 comes in. In TIVO-3, Tivozanib was again tested head-to-head with Nexavar, but this time in patients who had received 2 or 3 prior regimens. Top-line results of this trial were actually released earlier this week and showed that Tivozanib did statistically increase progression-free survival in comparison to Nexavar. But similar to the previous trial, the initial analysis showed a trend toward a slight reduction in overall survival in the Tivozanib arm. This isn't the final OS data at all. It only includes about 46% of the potential OS events that could happen during the trial. But either way, it's definitely not a great sign for a drug that's had issues with poor overall survival results in the past. The company announced that final data from TIVO-3 would be available in August of next year. And they also kind of confirmed that they still intend on filing for approval in the U.S. based off of both of these trials. And they hope to do that within the next 6 months. But if final results continue showing that Tivozanib actually has a numerically worse overall survival, there's a chance that the company would be met with another complete response letter. If that were to happen, there are other avenues that the company could pursue, mainly testing the drug in combination with PD-1 or PD-L1 inhibitors. Tivozanib has already been tested with Opdivo in a trial called Tinovo, which had positive results initially. There are a ton of these different TKI and immunotherapy combinations in development for RCC right now, but Tivozanib could potentially have an advantage over other TKIs in these types of combinations because it is slightly more tolerable than some of the other TKIs. So this could be the route forward should the FDA have similar thoughts about TIVO-3 as they did TIVO-1. But any questions on Tivozanib?
So you mentioned there one of the ways it might try and differentiate its tolerability. Is that to do with selectivity in terms of action, or is it another reason?
Yeah, it actually is mainly due to selectivity towards VEGF specifically. There are other products on our RCC market currently that target VEGF in addition to other things. Products like Cabometyx, Inlyta, Lenvima, Nexavar, Sutent, all these products target other things in addition to VEGF as multi-kinase inhibitors. So Tivozanib's kind of selectivity towards VEGF does allow it, or seem to allow it to have a better tolerability profile. Any other questions on Tivozanib before we move on to the next product? No. Okay. Last product I wanted to speak about today was larotrectinib. Larotrectinib is Loxo Oncology's selective TRK inhibitor, which has been already filed for approval in the U.S. and the EU for patients with advanced solid tumors harboring the NTRK gene fusion. In the U.S., larotrectinib has already been granted priority review, and the target action date for an FDA decision is actually November 26th, so pretty soon here. The regulatory filings for larotrectinib were based on the pooled data from 3 early phase basket trials in patients with solid tumors. And this data was actually presented earlier this year at ESMO. It showed a really impressive overall response rate of 81%, and given the median duration of response wasn't reached, it seems as though these responses are super durable as well. And an important note is that the responses were seen regardless of patient age or cancer type, which is a very important note to have it for a drug that's looking to gain approval for a tumor agnostic indication. NTRK fusions are pretty common in certain rare cancers like infantile fibrosarcoma, thyroid cancer, and gliomas, but they also occur to a small degree in more common cancers like lung cancer and colorectal cancer. So altogether, it forms a pretty large target population for TRK inhibitors. And as the first product likely to be available for these patients, larotrectinib should see pretty good uptake. It might be slightly limited by the testing practices for these genetic mutations, but apart from that, as the first drug available, it should see significant uptake. It is probably going to see competition from Roche's TRK inhibitor, entrectinib, pretty soon after it launches. Data for entrectinib was also presented at ESMO, and looking at it comparatively, its clinical profile wasn't as impressive as larotrectinib's, but because of differences in patient demographics in the trials and because survival data for larotrectinib isn't available yet, it's hard to kind of definitively say which is a better option at this point. But at any rate, Roche is planning on filing for approval of entrectinib early next year as well. So it won't be long before larotrectinib has a direct competitor also on the market. Any questions about larotrectinib?
I guess we're seeing more and more of these tumor agnostic indications in oncology. Do you think that companies developing these targeted drugs are going to continue? Is it a trend now in oncology to pursue approval in these tumor agnostic indications?
Yeah, definitely. That's a great question. I think that's definitely the route that the development of targeted drugs is going to continue to go. I think the first tumor agnostic approval we saw was Keytruda and MSI-high solid tumors, and this could potentially be the second. So I think this is definitely a good way for companies to basically continue to develop targeted drugs and for a broad population without having to do individual trials in some of the smaller tumor types. And especially with, I guess, continued uptake of things like next generation sequencing, which can help easily identify patients with addressable mutations. I definitely think that's the route that the industry will continue to go, especially with targeted products. Any other questions on larotrectinib?
Just one final question from me, Hardik. Do you know if the company, either for this drug or the competitor drug that you mentioned, I think from Roche, did they use any cutoffs in terms of what percentage of tumor cells needed to have this fusion present? And if so, is there any way in terms of the mutational testing that patients will be selected in the real world?
Yeah, I haven't seen any specific information in regards to particular cutoffs used to define a patient as NTRK gene fusion positive kind of officially. The trial protocols for larotrectinib really just said that patients needed to be deemed NTRK gene fusion positive as determined by either next generation sequencing tests or fluorescence in situ hybridization tests, which were performed at certified laboratories according to their protocols. So from what I understand, immunohistochemistry can also be used to look for specifically overexpression of TRK proteins. And Loxo has separate partnerships with Illumina and Ventana to develop both next-generation sequencing platforms and immunohistochemistry platforms as companion diagnostics for larotrectinib once it launches. So it should have two kind of routes of identification of these patients. Any other questions on larotrectinib before I hand over to Dominique to wrap us up here? Nope.
None for me. Okay. Well, that wraps up our fourth quarter Outlook webinar for 2018. Thank you, everyone, for listening. We hope you found this helpful and informative. As a reminder, if you submitted questions through this webcast, we will be collecting and answering them by email, or alternatively, you can also submit questions after the webinar at the email address which is shown on the screen, pharma@informa.com, and we will get back to you as soon as we can. Thank you, everyone.